Snow swallowed her suitcase whole, the night the whole town cast her out, and the rancher's 5 words would change everything Winona thought she knew about strangers. Ada Voss threw the case into the street outside the boarding house, and somebody near the stove laughed low into his coffee. Winona bent for the handle with fingers gone numb, snow already soaking through her gloves, and that was when boots crunched behind her in the dark. A tall man in a heavy coat stood at the hitch rail, hat brim dusted white, watching her the way no one in Larkspur had watched her all evening, like she was simply a woman standing in the cold. "I've got a spare room." Quiet as a held breath, and the whole street went still enough to hear the snow fall. That moment came at the end of a long, hard day. To understand it, you have to go back to the wagon that rolled into Larkspur that same afternoon, and to a woman who had learned, town after town, to keep one hand always on the handle of her suitcase. The freight wagon groaned into Larkspur, New Mexico territory. Just as the light went the color of old iron, wind came down hard off Pinon Ridge, carrying grit and cold that cut through wool like it was nothing at all. The driver hunched into his coat and pointed 2 fingers through the blowing snow toward the huddle of rooftops ahead. "Town's there," he grunted. "Last run before the pass shuts for winter." Winona climbed down carefully, boots sinking past her ankles into snow. Nobody had bothered to clear from Main Street. Her hands had gone stiff an hour ago. She flexed them once around the worn handle of her case, pulled her shawl tight at her throat, and stood there, a moment, looking at the town the way she had learned to look at every town now, searching out the shape of trouble before it found her first. Larkspur looked smaller than most, a church with a crooked steeple, a feed store with frost thick on the glass, smoke lifting from chimneys into a sky already gone blue-black. Lantern light swayed outside a saloon, laughter spilling into the cold each time the doors swung open. The driver handed down a folded letter, her recommendation from the last town's doctor, the one who had trusted her hands even after the rest of that town stopped trusting her name. She tucked it inside her coat and nodded once. He tipped his hat and snapped the reins, and within a minute the wagon had vanished into the storm, leaving Winona alone in the middle of Main Street with 1 suitcase, a satchel of dried herbs, and nowhere warm to go. She had been 3 years on this road now, since the trouble in Silver Springs. 3 years of small rooms and shorter welcomes, of doctors who wanted her hands until the gossip caught up, and then wanted her gone. She carried what little was left of the old life, folded flat in that suitcase, her grandmother's braided cord, a strip of turquoise-beaded leather she wore only when nobody was looking, 3 medicine books gone soft at the corners, and the letter she never opened anymore. What she carried in her satchel mattered more out here. Sage and juniper and wild horehound, mint for fever, yarrow for a wound that wouldn't close. Her grandmother had taught her all of it along the creek beds of her childhood, patient the way only a grandmother can be, and Winona had spent a decade since proving, town by unwelcoming town, that the teaching had taken. Her family had been Apache once out of the White Mountain country, before the agents and the fences and the long marches scattered so many households into pieces. Winona had grown up straddling 2 worlds, taught to set a bone the old way by her grandmother, and taught to read a Boston medical text by a mission school that never quite decided whether it wanted her educated or erased. She had learned early that both worlds could use her hands and neither would fully claim her, and she had made her peace with that a long time ago, the way a person makes peace with weather. What she had never made peace with was the particular cruelty of a room going quiet the moment somebody noticed the color of her skin before they noticed the medicine bag on her hip. She had stopped expecting better. She had not stopped hoping for it. The boarding house sat near the Mercantile, yellow light glowing warm through its windows, and for one dangerous second the sight of it almost convinced her she had finally outrun the last year of her life. She pushed through the door. Heat rushed over her face, along with the smell of wet wool and beef stew, simmering somewhere behind a kitchen wall. Conversation softened the instant she stepped inside. Several men turned to look the way men in small towns always turn to look at a woman traveling alone, and Winona pulled off her glove slowly, trying not to notice the silence gathering around her shoulders like a second coat. Behind the counter stood Ada Voss, broad-shouldered, iron-gray hair pinned severe against her skull. Winona stepped forward and held out the folded letter. "I was told you might have a room." Ada wiped her hands on her apron before taking the paper. Her face stayed neutral at first. Then it changed. Her eyes narrowed, and the room seemed to shrink in around Winona's shoulders. Ada unfolded the letter fully and squinted at the signature. "Silver Springs," she read aloud flat. "Silver Spring." Nobody moved. Winona felt every pair of eyes in the room settle onto her at once. Ada looked up slow. It wasn't a question. "Yes, ma'am." Winona kept her hands still at her sides, and her chin level, the way she had learned to hold it in a dozen rooms just like this one. A man near the stove muttered something to his neighbor. Another laughed short into his glass. Ada folded the letter once, sharp. "I heard about you." Winona kept her voice level. "I'm only asking for a room." Ada's mouth thinned. "You should ask somewhere that welcomes your kind." The words landed harder than the cold outside had, and Winona understood in the small silence that followed exactly which part of her Ada meant. Not the healer, not the woman with a scandal trailing her like smoke, but the dark braid under her shawl and the copper of her skin. She had heard it phrased kinder before. She had heard it phrased crueler. Ada came around the counter, snatched the suitcase up off the floor by Winona's boots, and shoved it hard toward the door. It hit the threshold and toppled sideways into the snow. "You bring trouble into my house, and my family stop coming." Not one voice in that room rose to argue it. Winona looked at the open doorway, at her case lying half buried already, and her throat burned, but she would not cry here. Not in front of strangers who had already decided, before she said a single word, exactly what kind of woman she was. She bent to gather her gloves. That was when she noticed the man outside, tall, broad, through the shoulders, under a dark winter coat, snow-dusted across it, one gloved hand resting easy on the reins of a black horse tied at the rail. He had been standing there the whole time, not smiling, not judging. Just watching, with a stillness that felt entirely different from the stares inside. When Winona stepped back out into the storm, Ada shut the door behind her, hard enough to rattle the windows. The wind hit like broken glass. Winona crouched beside the fallen case, brushing snow from the cracked leather straps with shaking fingers, and pulled once at the handle before straightening to walk blind into whatever came next. Boots crunched softly behind her. She turned fast, ready for another insult. The man from the hitch rail had crossed the street. Up close, he looked older than she'd first guessed. Mid-30s, weathered along the jaw, eyes the gray of wood smoke under his hat brim. He looked once at her suitcase, once at the shut door behind her, and understood the whole shape of it without needing to ask. The horse beside him shifted, steam rising off its nose into the freezing air. "I've got a spare room." That was all. No questions about where she'd come from or what they were saying about her inside. No warning about gossip he'd surely already caught wind of. Just 5 words, drifting white into the cold. Winona stared at him, and for a moment she genuinely forgot how to answer. Snow pushed across Main Street in long silver sheets. Somewhere down the road, a shutter banged loose against wood. "You don't know me." He reached for his saddle strap. "Name's Garrett." His voice came low, unhurried, a man clearly unused to wasting words on anything that didn't need them. He tipped his head once toward the dark road running north out of town. "Storm's getting worse." As if that settled something. Winona looked back at the boarding house windows glowing behind their curtains, shadows moving inside, people eating supper and pretending not to watch. Then she looked down at her own hands wrapped so tight around the suitcase handle. Her knuckles had gone pale. Under the cold, something in her chest threatened to crack wide open right there in the snow. Not because she was being rescued. She had never once needed rescuing, and she would not have gone with a man who thought otherwise. But because after months of slammed doors and turned backs, and whispers pitched just loud enough to be heard, a stranger had finally looked at her like she was only a person standing in the cold. Nothing more, nothing less. Garrett lifted her suitcase before she could argue and lashed it behind the saddle, then held out his hand to help her mount. She hesitated only a second before setting her frozen fingers into his glove. His grip stayed steady, warm even through the leather. She climbed up behind him, careful not to hold on more than the horse required, and they turned north out of Larkspur without another word between them. The road climbed through dark timber and open stretches of frozen pasture where wind swept low across the snow like smoke over water. Winona sat behind Garrett, one hand braced against the saddle's edge, so she wouldn't need to hold on unless the footing turned bad. The cold sharpened the higher they climbed. He rode like a man who knew every bend of that trail, with his eyes shut, barely shifting except to pull his collar tighter against the wind. After the better part of an hour, lights appeared through the trees ahead. The ranch sat low under the shadow of the ridge, a barn leaning into the wind beside a horse pen crusted white, smoke drifting from the house chimney in one thin gray ribbon. Garrett dismounted first and reached up for her case before she could climb down herself. A lantern burned beside the porch steps. Careful! Wood freezes slick this time of year. Inside, the house smelled of pine smoke and coffee grounds, and something faintly sweet she couldn't place at first. Dried apples, maybe. The warmth of it nearly hurt after so many hours in the cold. A boy sat curled at the far end of the kitchen table under a blanket, a book open in front of him. He clearly wasn't reading anymore. 9, maybe 10 years old, thin-shouldered, dark hair falling into serious eyes. He looked up when the door opened. Garrett hung his coat by the stove. "Noah, this is Miss Winona." The boy studied her a long, careful second, without smiling, then gave one small nod and dropped his eyes back to the book. "That all he says?" The words slipped out before she could catch them back. Something close to amusement crossed Garrett's face. Most days. He lifted the lantern again and led her down a narrow hall beside the kitchen. "Room's back here." The small room sat just past the pantry. A cot stood beneath the window with a heavy wool blanket folded neat across it, a wash basin on the dresser, a black iron stove already laid with kindling in the corner. Winona noticed the details right away. Fresh water in the pitcher, a clean towel, a pair of worn gloves set beside the basin. Not charity preparation. Garrett set her case down carefully beside the cot. "Belonged to my wife." He glanced once around the small space. "She did her sewing in here." The words settled quiet between them. Winona lowered her eyes. "I can sleep elsewhere, if it's difficult. It's just a room. No sharpness in it, only fact." He crouched at the stove and struck a match against his boot heel. Orange light bloomed slow inside the iron grate. "You'll be warm enough once that catches." He stood. "Supper's on the stove, if you're hungry." "I'm grateful." He gave one short nod as though gratitude embarrassed him a little, and left her alone. For a long while, Winona simply stood there, listening to wind push against the walls. The room felt strange, after months of boarding house corners and rented cots. Too quiet, too careful. She knelt beside her suitcase and opened its slow, folded dresses, the small leather kit of needles and thread, 3 worn medicine books wrapped in cloth, the cloth pouch of dried herbs she never let leave her sight, and a packet of letters tied in faded ribbon she touched only briefly before closing the case again. In the kitchen, a bowl waited near the stove, beef stew gone thick from sitting, cornbread wrapped warm in cloth. Noah sat at the table still pretending to read. Winona took the chair farthest from him so the boy wouldn't feel crowded. For a while, only spoons and the crackling fire filled the silence. "You from Silver Springs?" She paused over her spoon. I was, once. Before that, other places. He considered that, then went quiet again over his book. Garrett came in a few minutes later, carrying an armload of split wood dusted with snow, stacked it beside the stove, and pulled off his gloves. Noah finally glanced toward him. Storm's getting worse. It'll pass by morning. Eyes on the dark window, not on her. Winona noticed then that every time Garrett crossed the kitchen, he checked the stove in her room through the cracked hallway door, quiet, without a single word about it. If a story like this keeps you warm on a cold night, tap join beside the channel name and become a channel member. You will never miss the next lonely road home. Later that night, Winona lay awake listening to sounds she didn't yet know. Wind scraping snow along the siding, horses shifting in the barn, wood settling low in the cold. Sometime past midnight came coughing. Not ordinary coughing. Tight, frightened, wrong. She sat up fast. Another cough echoed down the hall, followed by hurried footsteps, and she opened her door to find Garrett carrying Noah, the boy's small body shaking with every strained breath, his face gone pale under the lantern light. Real fear showed plain on Garrett's face for the first time since she'd met him. He can't catch his breath. Winona crossed the hall without thinking. Get water boiling, already moving toward them, already reaching. Garrett moved instantly. Noah struggled against each breath, small fingers gripping hard at his father's shirt front. Winona knelt beside the boy near the kitchen stove and loosened the blanket at his chest. Easy now. Don't fight the breathing, just let it come. She opened her satchel and pulled the small cloth pouch of dried herbs, mint, sage, a little wild horehound root her grandmother had taught her to gather along the creek beds every autumn. Garrett returned with steaming water. She dropped the herbs in, covered the bowl briefly with a towel, and guided Noah closer to the rising steam. That's it. Slow breaths. Follow mine. The boy trembled hard. Garrett crouched beside them, one hand braced against the table edge, so tight his knuckles had gone white. How long's he had this? Not looking up from the steam. Since last winter, doctor. Come through once. Said cold air makes it worse. Doesn't sound like anybody taught him how to ease it through. No blame in it, only fact. Garrett's jaw tightened. My wife knew some things. After she passed, I never learned what helped. Noah coughed again, and then, slowly, painfully, the tightness began to loosen. Minutes passed, then more, until the worst of it eased enough for the boy to lean weak against Winona's shoulder asleep before dawn, while snow hissed soft against the windows. Garrett stood across the kitchen watching them in the low firelight, and neither of them found anything worth saying. And somewhere in those quiet early hours, something in that lonely house shifted for the first time in years. Morning came pale and hard over the ridge. The storm had passed in the night, leaving the pasture buried under smooth white drifts, glittering under a weak winter sun. Noah slept late beneath two quilts pulled to his chin. Garrett stood at the stove, pouring coffee into thick ceramic mugs, and slid one across the table toward Winona. Thank you. She wrapped both hands around the mug, letting the heat settle into fingers still stiff from the cold. He usually wheezes worse after storms. Doesn't seem anyone showed him how to breathe through it, she said again. Gentler. This time Garrett looked into his coffee a moment before answering. My wife knew. Learned some of it from her own mother. His eyes stayed on the cup. After she passed, I did what I could. Didn't always know if it was the right thing. Winona noticed the careful way he handled the subject of grief, like a man crossing ice that might not hold his weight. And she let the quiet sit between them, the way quiet sometimes needs to. Noah wandered in an hour later in thick wool socks and one of his father's old flannel shirts hanging near to his knees. He paused when he saw Winona still sitting there. You stayed. Something in the two words caught her off guard. I said I would. The boy considered that seriously. then climbed into his chair. That same morning, while she rolled her sleeves to help with the dishes, Noah caught sight of the strip of turquoise-beaded leather at her wrist, the one she usually kept tucked under her cuff out of habit more than shame. He studied it a long moment with the same seriousness he gave everything. "My grandmother made this," Winona told him, turning her wrist so the light caught the beads. "She said the pattern was for safe travel. I've worn it through every town I've ever left." Noah considered that with the gravity of a boy weighing something important. Did it work? She thought about the question, longer than she expected to. "Some days better than others," she said finally, and something about her own honesty surprised her. Noah nodded, satisfied, and did not ask again, but she noticed after that he watched her hands whenever she worked, the way a child watches anything he has decided is worth understanding. By afternoon, the ranch had settled into its rhythm. Garrett rode the fence line along the north pasture, while Winona sat near the kitchen window, mending a split sleeve on one of Noah's coats, the house creaking soft around her. For the first time in months, she found she did not feel the need to keep her boots laced by the door. She spent part of that quiet hour teaching Noah, who had wandered close and pretended not to be curious, the smell of dried yarrow against the smell of sage, and how to tell them apart with his eyes shut. He got it right twice out of 3 tries, and the third time he grinned before he could stop himself, and something in Winona's chest went warm that had nothing to do with the stove. 2 days later, Garrett drove her into Larkspur for supplies, the wagon bed loaded with hides bound for the tannery. The town had not softened much in her absence from its streets. A woman crossing in front of the mercantile pulled her daughter closer by the shoulder as they passed, and a man loading feed sacks outside the livery watched Winona a beat too long before turning his back on purpose. Garrett noticed. He said nothing, only shifted his stance on the boardwalk, so he stood between her and the loudest of the loiterers outside the saloon, an old habit of a man used to shielding livestock from weather he could not stop. Winona did not need shielding, and told him so quietly while they loaded flour and coffee and a length of new flannel for Noah's growing wrist. But she noticed, too, that she let him stand there anyway, and that the letting felt different than it should have after only a handful of days. At the mercantile counter, the clerk counted her coin twice before handing back her change, the old suspicion in his eyes, and Garrett paid the difference himself before she could object, sliding 2 more coins across the counter without comment, as if correcting a scale that had been weighed wrong. Nobody in that store said a kind word to her. That whole visit, nobody needed to. She rode home beside a man who had simply refused to let the town's meanness land, and that, she was beginning to understand, might be its own kind of kindness. Near dusk, hoofbeats came up the road. Garrett glanced up from the porch before opening the door. Deputy Cole Mercer stepped inside, tracking snow across the threshold, tall and sharp-faced, smelling of cold tobacco and horse sweat. His eyes landed on Winona at once. "Town talks fast." Garrett shut the door behind him. "You here for something useful, or just the talk?" Cole peeled off his glove slow. "Post came through from Silver Springs this morning, letter attached to it." He reached into his coat and unfolded a paper. "Seems Miss Winona here left a fair amount of trouble behind." Garrett stayed quiet, arms crossed. Cole looked at her directly now. Merchant named Franklin Cade. Wed. Wealthy family. Big house on the east side of town. A pause. Word is, his wife caught him carrying on with the help. The quiet that followed felt louder than the storm had. Noah glanced between the 2 men, uncertain. 3 months later, that man put a revolver in his mouth. Winona lowered her eyes to the stitching in her lap. Outside, wind brushed soft against the house. Garrett leaned one shoulder against the wall by the stove. "You finished?" "Not a question." Cole frowned. "You ought to know who's living under your roof." "That all depends on whether I asked." The deputy studied him a long second, then his gaze slid back to Winona. Not cruel exactly. Just tired in the way of a man who'd watched too many small-town stories curdle. "You planning to stay long, Miss Winona?" She folded the coat carefully before answering. "I never planned very far ahead." Cole gave a short nod and headed for the door, pausing once more before he left. "People are already talking." "They usually are." Garrett's voice stayed flat as slate. Cole stepped back into the cold and rode off down the road, and the house stayed quiet after that. Too quiet. That evening, Winona stood alone at the sink, washing supper dishes, while Garrett sharpened a blade near the stove, slow, steady pulls of stone against steel. Finally, she broke the silence. He didn't lie. The whetstone slowed. She dried her hands and turned to face him. "Franklin Cade cornered me in his pantry after a dinner party." Her voice stayed even, though her fingers tightened on the towel. "I fought him off." His wife walked in halfway through it. The scraping sound stopped entirely now. She believed the easier story, that I'd gone after her husband. It was simpler than the truth, and simpler was what that whole town wanted. Garrett watched her, not with pity, not with judgment, only attention. "After he died, people decided I'd ruined him. And did you quiet? No accusation in it. The question should have hurt. Strangely, it didn't. No." He held her gaze a moment longer, gave one nod, and went back to the blade in his hands. No speech, no promise. And somehow, the plainness of it left her more unsettled than anger. Late that night, she woke to hammering out in the hall. She reached for her boots and opened the door carefully. Garrett stood in the lantern light, repairing the loose hinge on her door with a screwdriver and a handful of small iron nails. Wind kept catching it. You could have waited for morning, rattled all night. He tested the hinge once with his hand and stepped back, satisfied. Only then did she notice the fresh stack of split wood he'd left beside her stove. Enough for several days. He picked up the lantern. "You wake early. Figured you'd want dry wood before dawn." Then he was gone down the hall before she could find anything to say, and she stood there barefoot on the cold floorboards a long while after, understanding that a man like Garrett did not say things with speeches. He said them with hinges and firewood and 5 plain words spoken, once in a snowstorm. The next morning clouds gathered heavy again over the ridge, and by afternoon the sky had turned dark enough to blue the whole pasture. Noah hadn't come in for supper. Garrett looked once through the kitchen window toward the barn. Boy was supposed to bring the gray colt in before weather turned. Another gust rattled the house hard. Winona looked out at the empty yard and felt something uneasy move through her chest. Then Garrett saw it, the small side gate near the lower fence, hanging open against the storm. For 1 second nobody moved. Wind pushed hard across the pasture, carrying loose snow in long white sheets, and somewhere beyond the barn came the sound of a horse crying out. Garrett grabbed his coat off the wall. Winona was already pulling on her boots. He took the gray colt. Fool animal bolts every time weather turns. His voice had gone low and tight. He reached for the lantern and the rifle by the door. "Stay here." Not even a glance her way. Winona stared at him like he had said something unreasonable. "You think I'm letting you search that ridge alone?" For half a second he looked ready to argue it. Then another gust tore across the pasture, and he turned for the barn instead, and she followed close on his heel, without waiting for permission she had never once asked for. They rode out minutes later under a sky gone nearly black with storm. Winona sat astride Garrett's second horse, wrapped in one of his heavier coats, fingers already numb around the reins. The trail narrowed as it climbed higher into the ridge timber, pines bent low under the weight of new snow, wind moaning long and hollow through the branches, until the whole mountain felt alive around them. Garrett shouted the boy's name again and again into the storm. Nothing came back. Winona kept scanning the drifts ahead, eyes burning from cold and blowing snow, until finally, there. A shape moving near a stand of dead timber uphill from the trail. Twice the trail vanished, entirely beneath fresh drift, and twice Garrett dismounted to walk it out on foot, testing the ground with the butt of the rifle before trusting the horses over it again. Winona's face had gone numb past feeling, by then ice crusting along her lashes, but she kept her eyes moving over the timberline the whole climb, the way she had once tracked a lost calf through a spring flood with her grandmother, reading the snow for anything that wasn't wind-shaped. It was that old habit, more than luck, that caught the second set of tracks half filled in beside the trail. Not a boy's boot, but a shod horse's, staggering, then stopping altogether. She called it out to Garrett over the wind. He didn't ask how she knew what she was looking at. He only turned the horses toward it. Garrett spurred hard. They found Noah crouched beside the gray colt, near a half-collapsed line shack, buried against the rocks, the boy's eyes red and frightened, teeth chattering too hard to talk at first. Horse slipped, wouldn't stand back up. Garrett dropped from the saddle so fast the snow burst under his boots and caught the boy against his chest hard enough. Noah nearly lost his footing. "Don't you ever do this again. You hear me?" His voice broke rough around the edges. Noah nodded into his coat, small fists gripping the wool. That was when Winona heard it, a low groan from inside the shack. Garrett heard it too, and they traded one quick look before moving toward the doorway together. Inside smelled of wet wool and blood and cold ash. A man lay half-conscious against the wall under a torn canvas blanket. Snow drifted across one shoulder where the roof had partly caved in, his leg bent wrong beneath him. Winona recognized him at once. Deputy Cole Mercer. His eyes opened weak at the lantern light. "Horse threw me. Thought I could make town before dark." Then he looked properly at Winona kneeling beside him, and something complicated crossed his face. Not suspicion this time, just pain and something close to shame. Winona cut away the fabric near his leg with her small sewing scissors, careful and quick. The bone hadn't broken through the skin, but swelling had already started bad. "We need heat." Garrett moved without hesitation, breaking apart old crate boards for kindling. The fire caught slow while wind battered the shack hard enough to shake dust loose from the rafters. Winona wrapped Cole's leg tight, with strips torn from an old blanket, while Noah sat near the flames wrapped in his father's coat, pale and silent. Cole gritted his teeth once as she tightened the splint. "You always this gentle?" "Too stubborn." A faint breath of laughter escaped him before the pain swallowed it again, and something in his tired eyes shifted toward her that had nothing left of a deputy weighing a stranger. "I read you wrong," he admitted once low, while she checked. The splints give. It wasn't the word she noticed so much as the way his eyes wouldn't quite hold hers while he said it. A man used to badges and paperwork, discovering there wasn't a form for this particular kind of being wrong. Winona only nodded and kept working, because an apology from a man flat on his back with a broken leg was worth exactly what it cost him to say it, and she had learned a long time ago not to weigh those too heavy either way. Hours passed slow inside that little shack, the storm only worsening outside. Garrett fed the fire, while Winona checked Cole's pulse and kept Noah sipping warm water melted over the flames. Past midnight, the deputy finally drifted into uneasy sleep, and the shack fell quiet except for the wind. Garrett sat near the doorway, sharpening a stick absently with his knife. "You knew who he was, the second you saw him." "I did. And I helped him anyway." She kept her eyes on the fire. "People still hurt others when they're cruel to them. It doesn't make them not need help. It just makes helping harder to give." Members of this channel get bonus scenes and early access to next week's story. Tap join beside the channel name today to become one. The knife stopped moving in Garrett's hand. For a long while, neither of them found anything to fill the silence with, and then quietly, almost as though the storm itself had dragged the words loose from him, he began. "My wife died 3 winters back." Winona looked up. Fever after a late snowfall. His eyes stayed on the flames. Doctor couldn't cross the pass in time. The firelight shifted gold across the hard lines of his face. I kept thinking, if somebody had known what to do. He swallowed once, hard. Maybe Noah wouldn't have lost her. Winona found nothing worth saying. Words would only have made it smaller. Instead, she rose and crossed to where Noah lay sleeping against the wall, half his coat kicked away, and pulled the wool back careful around his shoulders. When she straightened, Garrett was watching her, and something shifted in his face. Then, not sudden, not dramatic, just a door he'd kept shut a long time finally coming open a crack. Snow hammered the ridge until nearly dawn. By first light, the storm had weakened enough to travel, and they got Cole onto a horse between them, started down toward Larkspur with Noah riding ahead beneath his father's heavy hat pulled to his ears. The ride home passed mostly in silence, but it wasn't the same silence they'd carried up the mountain. When the ranch finally appeared through the morning fog, Winona felt something dangerous stir quiet in her chest. Something warmer than gratitude and harder to pack away in a suitcase. They brought Cole in and settled him near the kitchen stove until the town doctor could be sent for from Pine Hollow, and before noon word had already begun spreading through Larkspur that the woman they'd called Trouble had ridden into a mountain storm and brought the deputy home alive with her own 2 hands. But that evening, after the house had gone quiet again, Garrett passed Winona's room and stopped. The door stood open. Her suitcase sat on the bed open, half packed. He stood in the hallway holding the lantern low, cold air drifting through the cracks around the windows. Winona looked up from the bed, and for a second neither of them found a word. The case sat open beside her folded dresses and medicine books, the same way it had sat in a dozen boarding houses and rented rooms across the territory, ready to leave before trouble could settle too deep. Garrett's eyes moved once over the packed clothes before returning to her face. "You heading somewhere?" His voice stayed too calm for the question underneath it. "Snow will break in a few weeks." She kept folding, careful, not looking up. "Road south should open again." "That's not what I asked." The lantern flame shifted between them. She lowered her hands into her lap. "People in town change their minds today. Doesn't mean they won't change them back tomorrow. Cole told half the saloon you saved his life. That's not the same as belonging somewhere." The word settled heavy into the room. Outside, wind moved through the barn eaves with a long, low whistle. Garrett looked down at the floorboards before finding his voice again. "Noah asked if you were leaving." Something tightened across Winona's face. "What did you tell him?" "I told him I didn't know." She nodded once and closed the suitcase halfway, and the sound of the latch nearly broke something loose in him. But Garrett had spent most of his life holding words back until they went quiet inside him. So instead of saying what rose first to his throat, he only stepped back from the doorway. "Supper's in 10 minutes." Then he disappeared down the hall. The next morning, Larkspur looked different. Snow still capped the rooftops, smoke still drifted above the chimneys. But when Winona walked into the mercantile beside Garrett, conversation no longer stopped dead the way it once had. An old rancher's wife near the flour barrels pressed a basket of eggs into her hands, awkward, not quite meeting her eyes, for the boy heard he's doing better. At the feed store, a cattleman who'd once canceled Garrett's hauling contract tipped his hat instead of turning away. Even Ada Voss lowered her eyes when Winona passed the boarding house porch. No apology came. None was expected. Some towns only know how to be sorry quietly, one small kindness at a time, without ever once saying the word out loud, and this one, Winona thought, might just be learning how. Not everyone came around so easy. A woman outside the church still crossed the street rather than pass close, and a man at the livery still spat when Winona's shadow crossed his. Larkspur had not become a different town overnight. It had only cracked open, in a few places, enough light getting through that a person standing inside it could finally see her way to the door without flinching. Cole Mercer came by the ranch on crutches the following week, legs splinted stiff, to thank her properly this time without a badge of suspicion weighing down every word. He stayed for coffee longer than the errand required, and before he left he mentioned, almost sideways, that he'd told the mayor plain that any more letters chasing old Scandal out of Silver Springs could come through him first from now on. It wasn't an apology dressed up as anything grand. It was a man deciding, quietly and for good, which side of a town's meanness he intended to stand on. Winona thanked him for the coffee and said nothing else about it, but she noticed Garrett's shoulders sit a little looser after the deputy rode off, as if one more piece of the old danger had finally been set down. By evening, the square had begun filling with lanterns for the winter social held every year before Christmas. Pine boughs hung outside the church doors. Someone had rolled barrels in to build bonfires at the edges of the square, and fiddle music drifted warm through the freezing air. Winona nearly stayed behind at the ranch, but Noah stood by the stove buttoning his coat with serious concentration and finally looked over at her. "You comin' so?" She went. Snow fell light over Larkspur that night, soft enough to melt against wool collars before it settled. Lantern light glowed gold against the white streets. Winona stood near the edge of the crowd under the barbershop awning, gloved hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee, and people nodded to her now, not warm exactly, but honest, which felt like more. Across the square, Garrett spoke a moment with the reverend near the church steps, then looked up and found her standing alone in the lantern light. The fiddle slowed. He crossed the square without hurrying, hiding from the dancing. A faint smile touched her mouth. "Never been much good at it. Neither have I." That seemed to settle the matter for him. He held out his hand. Around them, boots scraped over packed snow, while couples turned slow beneath strings of swaying lantern light. Winona looked at his hand a long second before setting hers into it. His palm was warm, even through the gloves. Nearby, Noah had roped a boy his own age into a game near the bonfire, and was laughing loud enough to carry over the fiddle, a sound Winona had not once heard from him in her first weeks at the ranch, and she let herself watch him a moment before Garrett's hand found her waist and turned her back into the music. They moved awkward at first, him too tall, her too careful, but after a few turns, they found a rhythm simple enough not to need thinking about. Snow drifted quiet through the lantern glow around them, his hand resting steady at her waist, not possessive, just there. And for the first time since arriving in Larkspur, Winona stopped feeling like a woman waiting near the door. The song ended. Neither stepped away right off. The next tune started faster, livelier, and Garrett glanced toward the church road behind the square. "Walk with me." They left the music behind and followed the snowy road past the church fence, where the sounds of the festival softened under the wind. The ranch lights glowed faint in the distance below the ridge. Garrett stopped there beside the fence line, looking a long while toward home before he finally found the words. "That room stopped being spared the day you walked into it." Winona felt the breath leave her chest. No grand declaration followed, no rehearsed speech, just that one plain sentence hanging white in the cold air between them. She looked down quick, blinking hard once as snow gathered along her lashes, and Garrett noticed. Of course he noticed, but let it pass without comment. Slow, careful, he reached for her hand, and she let him take it. Behind them, the fiddle carried soft through the winter dark, while church lanterns flickered gold against the falling snow, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, Winona did not feel the urge to run. Spring came slow to the territory that year. Snow retreated first from the lower pasture, then the road south opened, then grass began pushing up stubborn and green through the thawing ground around the ranch. One warm morning, Winona stepped onto the porch, carrying her old suitcase out of habit more than planned, and stopped. Near the kitchen window, Garrett had built something new onto the side of the house through the last weeks of winter, a small room with fresh pine boards, 2 wide windows, shelves lined careful along the wall. A painted wooden sign hung beside the door, Winona's Remedies and Care. She stood very still. Inside sat a sturdy examination table Garrett had built by hand, fresh towels folded neat beside jars of herbs and medicine bottles, a small black stove already warming the room, shelves waiting for the sage and juniper and yarrow she had once had to hide inside a satchel like something shameful. Noah ran laughing across the yard, chasing the gray colt through wet spring grass, and Garrett looked up from the fence post he was repairing. Their eyes met across the pasture. Winona glanced down once at the suitcase still hanging from her hand, and then, quietly, almost without noticing she'd done it, she set it down beside the porch wall and left it there. For most folks, it might not have looked like much. Just an old suitcase resting against a weathered porch in the spring light. But for Winona, it was the first time in years she had stopped keeping herself ready to disappear. The first time she let a town and a man and a boy, learning to tell yarrow from sage with his eyes closed, decide that she was someone worth staying for. She still wore the beaded cord at her wrist most mornings, no longer tucked under her cuff. Her grandmother's pattern for safe travel had, in its own roundabout way, finally delivered her somewhere worth arriving. The shingle by the door would need a hook for it soon. She thought, a place for a healer's hands to hang the last thing she'd carried out of every hard year that came before this one, and she found she didn't mind the idea of it staying put. Maybe that's why a story like this one stays with a person, because, deep down, most of us know exactly what it feels like to stand outside a warm room, bracing for the judgment before it even comes. To keep one hand near the door, because life has taught you not to settle anywhere too comfortably, and maybe you know, too, what it means when one person changes that without a single grand speech. Just a warm stove lit before dawn, a repaired door hinge at midnight, a horse saddled in the cold so you don't have to ride into a storm alone. Sometimes love doesn't announce itself loudly. Sometimes it sounds like boots crossing a wooden floor after midnight to leave more firewood by your door. Garrett gave Winona something bigger than shelter. He gave her a place where she no longer had to stay ready to run, and a town that finally learned, slow and clumsy, to see her the way he had seen her from the very first night, not as a scandal walking into their midst, but simply as a woman standing in the snow who deserved a spare room. If this story found you tonight, stay a while longer, because there are still more lonely ranches, quiet rescues, and hard-won homes waiting out there beneath these western skies, and every one of them starts the same simple way this one did, with somebody finally deciding that a stranger in the cold was worth 5 plain words.